I'd like to wish everyone a very happy Christmas, or whatever it is you may celebrate at this time of year or not. And I'd like to thank everyone also who has supported this channel and myself in terms of likes and comments and emails I've received from you over the past year. They've been very much appreciated, and I am extraordinarily grateful to you for that. And the high point of this year has been, for me, the publication of my book, and once again, enormously grateful for the people who have supported me in that endeavour and bought my book. At this time last year, I did a short story on a cat in a South London house, I think. And I've been encouraged by a number of people to do the same this year. So in the past 2 days, I've written a short story and done an enormous number of scribbles to support it. And I've just got it finished. And I hope it might bring a smile to one or two people's face who share my sense of humour. And I don't think any crime has been committed there, though certainly someone got away with murder. I shall see.
The fete at Summer Penworthy was the highlight of the social calendar of the village in the days following the Great War, so it can easily be understood that the parish council spent a great deal of time in its planning. It was considered a particular triumph that Lady Willoughby Price of Meldrew Court was secured to open the fete and award the prizes. Of course, it was only to be expected that good-natured rivalries would spring up. First there was the matter concerning the bunting to be used. Mr. Bosanquet, the choirmaster and leader of the Bellringers chapter at St. Egwin's Church, favoured bunting of a floral design. Colonel Prothero, who, as well as being a prominent resident of Summer Penworthy, also happened to be chief constable, was adamant it should be a display of Union flags, featuring images of General Kitchener. The Reverend J. Symonds, vicar of St. Egwin's, did his best to mediate in these disputes and arrive at a compromise which involved Union flags interspersed with ones depicting flowers. He was, though, quite firm in the matter of General Kitchener's image. The fete was a matter of great pride to the village. As almost everyone knows, St. Egwin, the patron saint of egg and spoon races, worked his most important miracles at Summer Penworthy in the 13th century. As regards the events for the fete, the pies and pastries contest, jellies and jams, pickles and preserves, and largest onion contest were unhesitatingly approved. The raffle and refreshments, too, went through on the nod. Colonel Prothero proposed a tug-of-war between the men of the village as the starting event. Mr. Bosanquet was inclined to favour a Morris dancing display, of which he was said to be an enthusiastic and nimble-footed exponent. The real difficulties came about concerning the contests. The ladies of Summer Penworthy were a competitive lot. Those with ambitions in the egg and spoon race were already in training. Mrs. Summerskill was to be seen on the village green each morning, carrying a careful egg balanced on a spoon. Soon she was joined by Mrs. Wilde, and as the day of the fete drew closer, the common was a hive of activity. It gladdened the heart of the vicar as he cycled past the village green to see the ladies engaging so wholeheartedly in the event, although on seeing two ladies apparently sparring, he had occasion to remark to his curate, Mr. Appleby, that he did not recall there being any pugilistic events detailed for the fete that year. The competitiveness of the villagers might seem extraordinary to an outsider, but the victories enjoyed by Mrs. Hibbert in previous years had spurred them on. Mrs. Hibbert, an unpopular and highly competitive woman, carried off most of the trophies and monetary prizes across a range of events each year, but the means by which she had secured her remarkable achievements were said to be dubious. "She needs to be taken down a peg or two," said Mrs. Summerskill, expressing the general consensus of opinion. She had twice been runner-up to Mrs. Hibbert in the sack race. On the 14th of June, prompt at 9:30 a.m., Lady Willoughby Price, who arrived in her Rolls-Royce, pronounced the fete to be officially open. The weather was fine, there was a good turnout, and things started promisingly with events for children, and the refreshments table was doing particularly well. In the flower arranging tent, Mrs. Hibbert's entry caused much amusement. Her flowers, collected it was said from neighbours' gardens and even from the churchyard, formed so meagre a display that it was absurd to enter it. Her opponents informed her of this, and also said it was a shame on the village that Lady Willoughby Price should be confronted with such a sorry flower spectacle. However, a little later, when Mrs. Wilde visited the flower arranging tent, a competition in which she entertained hopes, she discovered her flowers had been unfavourably rearranged. Some of the stems were broken, and a couple of her garden roses had been wilfully decapitated with malice aforethought. She was naturally upset, and she accused Mrs. Summerskill, her great rival in this event, of sabotage. A heavy charge. Women took sides, and the mood quickly deteriorated. Some of the ladies began unfavourably rearranging the presentations of others. It was tit for tat, and there were arguments in which some of the flowers were seized from vases and used as weapons to strike one's opponents over the head with. By the time Lady Willoughby Price arrived to judge the contest, the flower tent was in a sorry state. Petals were strewn across the floor like confetti, and denuded stalks had been hastily stuffed back into vases. Her expression showed her dismay as the ladies stood by their respective arrangements, somewhat red-facedly awaiting her verdict. Curiously, in comparison with those of her competitors, Mrs. Hibbert's display, though quite inadequate of itself, was not now wholly offensive. Some of the cleverer villagers realized they had been tricked, especially when Mrs. Wilde reported seeing Bully Hibbert, Mrs. Hibbert's lively 11-year-old boy, lurking about the flower tent. A great deal of significance was attached to this sighting. Lady Willoughby Price, to everyone's chagrin, including her own, awarded first prize of £5 to Mrs. Hibbert. It was galling for them to hear Mrs. Hibbert making a speech about flower arranging and lecturing them about making a proper effort for the sake of the pride of the village and its good name. Mrs. Hibbert triumphed in the cakes and pastries competition which followed too. The exact facts are disputed, but it appears that all of the pastries and cakes entered in this particular event were found to have been destroyed, with the exception of Mrs. Hibbert's entry. That naturally aroused suspicions, and although her gooseberry flan and other wares were sampled and pronounced by Lady Willoughby Price to be quite inedible, there was little choice but to award her first, second, and third prizes, owing to the lack of competition in the event. A situation which caused considerable discontent amongst the ladies, excepting Mrs. Hibbert, who wore an expression, it was said, of ineffable self-satisfaction. The incident led to demands for her to be banned from the event for future years. But there was no proof whatsoever, and the fact that her son, Bully, a large boy for his 11 years, had been seen entering the pastries tent while others were preoccupied watching the hotly contested tug-of-war, was little more than a nasty slur in her view. For her part, Mrs. Hibbert only smiled at young Bully, ruffled his hair indulgently, gave him sixpence, and said, "Boys will be boys." Bully ran off to play with his friends. Mrs. Hibbert's remarkable success at the fete continued. A little later she won the egg and spoon race, the blue-ribboned event of the fete, and there immediately followed demands for a steward's inquiry. The manner of adhesion of her egg to the spoon fell under the gravest suspicion after it was discovered it had been affixed to the spoon with chewing gum. Furthermore, an inspection of Mrs. Hibbert's egg proved it to have been previously hard-boiled. Mrs. Hibbert was indignant. The egg had come from her husband's chickens this way, she said, and she claimed that some of his laying hens had very warm bottoms, and this might account for their eggs often being laid hard-boiled. This was regarded with great scepticism by the less trusting contestants. although the Reverend Simmons expressed himself willing to entertain the possibility of a miracle. In any case, nothing was proved. "It was put there deliberate," Mrs. Hibbert declared angrily, "to make me look bad. I never cheated on anyone in my life. It's a disgrace." It was with great reluctance that Lady Willoughby Price awarded her first prize. Mrs. Hibbert then went off in search of Bully, whom she located near the coconut shy, relieving 2 boys of their pocket money. Colonel Prothero frowned to himself. There was a definite air of brooding dissatisfaction looming. People gathered in small groups, discussing the events with great animation. As chief constable of the county, he wanted no trouble, and he decided there was a need for a uniformed officer to be present. He called his station superintendent, a man named Pomfrey, from the phone box outside the Fox and Whistle, and told him to send a police officer to attend the event immediately. Superintendent Pomfrey prevaricated. "A policeman at the village fete?" he inquired. "Yes," said Prothero. "Well," said Pomfrey, "we don't have a lot of men spare, sir, if we start supplying officers for the village fetes in the county." But Prothero would not be dissuaded. "I want your best man on the job," he insisted. Pomfrey frowned. Then his brow cleared, as an idea occurred to him, and he said, "I could send Alfie Rowbottom." "A good man, is he?" inquired the colonel. Pomfrey considered. He had not said so. "All my men are good men, sir," he said carefully. The colonel was satisfied. "Send him straight over," he said. "Things are getting ugly here." In fact, things seemed a little lighter when the colonel returned from the phone box. There was some merriment at the largest onion competition, where a number of contestants had gathered, because Mrs. Hibbert had entered a somewhat risibly diminutive specimen amongst those lined up for adjudication. There was much amusement amongst the aficionados of the popular root vegetable. Mrs. Hibbert shrugged this off. "I'm entitled to enter what I want," she said. "Mind your own business." Mrs. Oates, who led the general ribbing of Mrs. Hibbert, said, "What is the point of bringing a pickle along to an onion competition?" There was much laughter at this. Mrs. Oates had every reason to be confident. She had succeeded in growing an onion so large, everyone agreed it was more like a football than an onion. As it happens, this turned out to be an unfortunate comparison, because during a quiet period in the tent, young Bully appears to have mistaken it for actually being a football. He was quite mistaken in this belief, of course, but nonetheless was seen kicking it around the field energetically. His remarkable footballing skills were admired and remarked upon by many, but Mrs. Oates was not one of their number. She was so angry she could hardly speak. "The little ruffian!" cried Mrs. Oates at last. It was now the village showed the mettle it is famed for. All the onion contestants went off in hot pursuit of Bully Hibbert, who was surprisingly fleet of foot. It was an admirable endeavour, but quite in vain, and it had a most unwanted effect. In their anxiety to detain young Bully, the despoiler of the great onion, the onion tent was left unattended. It is not known exactly what happened, but all the remaining onions were either destroyed, removed, or stamped on. Never in all the history of summer Penworthy fetes had such a catastrophe occurred. Bert, Mrs. Hibbert's husband, a lazy but crafty sort of man, gave it as his opinion that it may have been a fox, which he had seen lurking near the onion tent around that time. "A nasty-looking creature, and sneaky," he confided to them. This seemed the likely explanation, but one of the women, entertaining an unworthy suspicion, commented that Bert Hibbert's eyes were streaming with tears, as though he had been in the vicinity of onions. But this was wrong, as it turned out, and Mr. Hibbert was found to have a softer heart than anyone knew, because he said the total ruination of the onion competition had moved him to tears. There was one consolation, though. It seems that Mrs. Hibbert, perhaps mindful of the hazard of onion despoiling foxes, had removed her own entry at some point before the havoc had been wrought. Now she presented it as the sole entrant to the competition. The prize-giving event which followed was a subdued affair. Lady Willoughby Price expressed herself surprised at the modest size of the winning onion, and when Mrs. Hibbert elected to give a speech thanking her competitors and said that the best woman had won after all, there was a general walkout. It was more than the other women could bear to hear her spouting on. The next event was one everyone was talking about, the three-legged race. In this event, as everyone knows, two people have their adjacently corresponding legs yoked together by a strap, and run a short race in which cooperation as well as athleticism is vital. Mrs. Hibbert had chosen for her partner a Mrs. Yeovil, a thin-faced woman, lean of frame, but reputedly fat of head, and here was where the clever money was accumulating. The odds were becoming silly. There was no longer any advantage in betting on Mrs. Hibbert at all. Her own husband, Bert, stood watching proceedings idly, a pipe in his mouth, still affected by the sadness he had felt at the ruination of the onions, judging by his eyes. The other competitors were becoming restive. They were afraid Mrs. Hibbert would yet again cheat. Representations were made to the organisers, and the matter was discussed at an extraordinary meeting of the Fate Committee in a corner of the field, and it was decided at length that partners should be drawn at random for the three-legged race, their names being drawn from a hat. Amidst all of the disharmony and gloom at the fete, there was a grim and peculiar satisfaction after the drawing of names when it was learned that Mrs. Hibbert had been twinned with Mrs. Prothero, the Colonel's wife. Mrs. Prothero was an estimable lady in her mid-50s. She had been a lady of full figure in her younger years, and had since filled out marvellously. Her legs were not good either, and she walked with the aid of a stick. It may be appreciated, therefore, the general satisfaction felt by Mrs. Hibbert's competitors that she had drawn the Colonel's wife as her partner. Mrs. Hibbert protested vehemently against the unfairness of the draw, but to no avail. She said she did not want to be tied to some fat old woman, a remark the Colonel took particular exception to. "She has only herself to blame," said Mrs. Oates, expressing the general feeling of satisfaction amongst the other women. The betting patterns shifted away from Mrs. Hibbert as a result of this development, although Mr. Hibbert, a slovenly sort of ill-favoured man, who kept chickens and did little but loaf about all day, took interest in this development. There was a lengthening of the odds, and a tide of betting against Mrs. Hibbert and her partner Mrs. Prothero occurred. By now Alfie Rowbottom, in button, tunic, and police helmet, had arrived. The authority of the law was on display for all to see. Colonel Prothero spoke to him after learning of his wife's pairing with her. "She'll not win this event with my wife tied to her," he opined. "No, indeed, sir," affirmed Alfie. "Your wife's a fat woman, sir." The Colonel looked annoyed, but said nothing. Bert Hibbert, who knew his wife's form better than anyone, decided to put £25 on her and Mrs. Prothero to win. The odds were steep by now, 10-1. It seemed madness to make such a bet. Someone called him a fool for chucking £25 away like that, but Bert thought differently. There was a great deal of interest as the competitors lined up. Most people had come to see Mrs. Hibbert get her comeuppance, without a doubt. The straps yoking the competitors to each other were loosely tied. But just before the race started, Mrs. Hibbert compressed her thin lips, and with a sideways glance at Mrs. Prothero, she bent down and tightened and double-knotted the strap. She had a determined look about her. "It needn't be so tight," complained Mrs. Prothero. "Well," said Mrs. Hibbert grimly, "we don't want it coming undone." Her competitors in the event grinned at the sight of the marvellously proportioned Mrs. Prothero tied to the lean and hungry Mrs. Hibbert. "This is one event she'll go without a prize," opined Mrs. Oates with some satisfaction. The Reverend Simmons drew Colonel Prothero's old war revolver, and the firing of this signalled the off. All competing pairings got away smartly, apart from the Colonel's wife and Mrs. Hibbert, who for some reason had not agreed upon a cooperative strategy as to which leg to commence the race with. The result was an unfortunate accident, in which Mrs. Hibbert came out of the blocks ferociously, while the unfortunate Mrs. Prothero was looking around, wondering who had fired a gun and why. I have looked carefully into this matter, and have formed the conclusion that the disparity between her and her partner in terms of speed of response, speed of movement, and also in mental preparedness for the event was too great. Mrs. Prothero was yanked off her feet and fell backwards onto the ground. It was plain to see what had happened, and all that was necessary was for the two ladies to gather themselves and give chase. Alas, this did not happen, owing, it may probably be ascertained, to the determination of Mrs. Hibbert in the matter. Mrs. Hibbert pressed on, and she made remarkable progress after her rivals, considering the impediment of dragging her recumbent partner behind her. It should also be said that it was thoroughly sportsmanlike of Mrs. Prothero to oblige by lying quite still during this, as a result of which she was towed along behind Mrs. Hibbert at a commendable speed. Everyone looked to Alfie, who had been at the side, to intervene in the race, but he had been distracted and found himself involuntarily applauding Mrs. Hibbert's efforts until a glance of utter fury from the Colonel checked him. "Stop the race!" called the Reverend Simmons urgently, joining the Colonel's similar but more robust imprecations. "Get over to her, man!" roared the Colonel at Alfie. He was not heard, it seems, amidst the general commotion. Not by Alfie Rowbottom, anyway. Everyone else heard him, and looked urgently to Alfie, who was whistling to himself and rocking on his heels, whilst watching the antics of young Bully Hibbert, who was playing with a cat. Mrs. Prothero's situation was an ignominious one. Her summer dress, bought specially for the occasion, was mostly up around her armpits by this time. I should mention, for the benefit of those interested in ladies' clothing and fashion, that Mrs. Prothero had exemplary taste in her choice of undergarments, which were of a delicate lilac hue, with a well-chosen floral design along the seams. As well as being commodious bloomers, they won her approval amongst those fortunate enough to have front-row positions in the crowd. People of sensibility, perhaps with no special interest in ladies' fashion, turned their heads away. The Reverend Simmons turned his eyes to heaven and shared some appropriate words with his Maker. The words shared by Colonel Prothero in Alfie Rowbottom's direction were better had his Maker not heard them. Even Mr. Bosanquet, never one to see eye to eye with the Colonel, called out, "My God, do something, man!" But Alfie was thoroughly distracted by seeing Bully Hibbert tying a train of tin cans to a cat's tail. He went off to investigate this. He did not hear the exaggerations of those watching the race, and they were exaggerations, such as the cries of, "She's killed Mrs. Prothero!" "It was absurd," said Alfie to his wife later that evening when he considered the matter. The very worst that could be said was that she had sprained her ankle in the rough and tumble of the race. Meanwhile, Colonel Prothero, no longer able to contain his indignation at his wife being dragged along the field before the entire village, decided to give chase himself. But the Colonel was not a young man. He was portly. His progress after his wife was not as rapid as he might have wished. People watched the Colonel, huffing and puffing after the athletes, with considerable amazement. But even so, they found it difficult not to admire the determination of Mrs. Hibbert, as well as to admire the charming design of Mrs. Prothero's undergarments. It was a feast for the villagers' eyes. Although being dragged through the mud and over rough ground cannot have been a pleasant experience for Mrs. Prothero, the fact that her head had come into contact with Mrs. Hibbert's boot on no less than 3 occasions had doubtless mitigated her suffering, since she appeared to be unconscious for most of the race. The cheering sight of Mrs. Hibbert's and Mrs. Prothero's colourful progress down the field would remain etched into the collective memory of Summer Penworthy for many years to come. It is an extraordinary thing to report, and was little regarded by those present, but Mrs. Hibbert and Mrs. Prothero succeeded not only in recovering their deficit in the race, but actually in overtaking their opponents to finish in first place. It was one of the greatest sporting achievements the county had witnessed. The first prize was duly awarded some 20 minutes after the St. John's ambulance had left, carrying Mrs. Prothero, who had partially regained consciousness by this time. Lady Willoughby Price was obliged to hand over a £5 note to Mrs. Hibbert, who collected the prize on behalf of herself and her partner, who was, of course, as yet insensible of her victory, owing to her being in a concussed state, and therefore not yet able fully to enjoy her success. There was, I am told, much grumbling amongst Mrs. Hibbert's competitors about the matter, some even claiming it was against the rules to drag a partner, but it all came to nothing. There was a bad atmosphere. The sky had clouded over. The crowd was subdued, which cast a pallor over the day. Ridiculous rumours that Mrs. Prothero had been killed did not help the matter, and the sight of the Hibbert family celebrating their matriarch's triumph, while Bert Hibbert collected a princely sum in winning his wager, only added to the general dissatisfaction. People argued over the silliest of things. It all finally came to an end when Mr. Bosanquet attempted to compliment the Colonel on his wife's selection of undergarment. A fight broke out between the two gentlemen. Alfie and the vicar succeeded in separating them only with the greatest of difficulty. The fete ended pretty much after that. People drifted away. Alfie, for his part, felt satisfied with a good day's work, all on overtime too. But curiously enough, he was never thanked by the Colonel. On inquiring of Mrs. Prothero's health on Monday morning, he was on the receiving end of some extraordinary bad language from the Colonel, which took him aback. He became privately convinced that the Colonel was not quite right in the head. His wife had a most advantageous twinning with Mrs. Hibbert, and, after all, he pointed out, she won, didn't she? She may have done, but Mrs. Prothero didn't want to talk about the village fete afterwards when she had recovered. People said her experience had soured her for such activities. There were others who said she wanted to finish her athletics career at the top. Lady Willoughby Price gave it as her opinion privately that there was too much inbreeding in the village, and it had deleteriously affected the minds of the villagers, most of whom she regarded as imbeciles. She certainly said she would never lend her support to such a sorry spectacle again. The fete, as is now well known, resulted in an inquiry being carried out by the parish council, which made recommendations for future events, including the employment of a private security contractor, the deployment of police in riot gear, and a detachment of the Highbury Fusiliers from the local garrison even, but these were never taken up. The village council decided there should be no further village fetes, and although it is often raised by a newcomer to the village, enthusiastic to revive the old traditions of St. Egwin, it is a fact that there has never been a village fete in Summer Penworthy since that summer day in 1928.